I'll be talking today about the DevOps experiments, some reflections from the startup I work for as we've scaled, and how we've been able to provide reliable service to markets that are traditionally underserved by technology during a period of high growth. So to introduce myself a little bit more, as I said, I'm a software engineer at Ngaza, a company dedicated to offering access to life-changing products, things like solar lights or cleaner cook stoves, to areas that are traditionally underserved by technology and in places that maybe don't have access to grid electricity. During my time at Ngaza, which started in January of this year, I've worked on our platform and operations teams, developing the core functionality that enables businesses to sell these devices to these underserved markets. Before that, I worked at ThoughtWorks as a software engineering consultant. Some of you who were here last year for DevOpsDays Auckland may remember me when I spoke about metrics that matter in continuous delivery. This year, I'm taking the organizational anthropology perspective that I developed while working as a consultant, that same interest in what are the team structures that enable organizations or individuals to succeed or set them up to fail, and applying it to the company I now work for to understand how we've been able to, in a period of high growth, develop practices and continue adapting in a way that provides more effective service to the company or to the communities we're serving. Today, I'll be giving you an overview of what Ngaza is. We're a relatively early-stage company. We're based out of San Francisco, and we're working in markets that aren't New Zealand, so I don't really expect you to have heard about us. I also want to talk about what we are and what we do, because I think it outlines why reliability matters to us, and also why it's a really hard thing to achieve. I'll give you some evolution and some history on how our team structure has changed. I'll talk a little bit about where we see our future going, and then end with some key takeaways that I think apply regardless of what markets you're trying to serve. To give you a little bit more context on the kinds of products that are being sold on our platform, the photo up there that you see is of one of the solar home systems that is sold on our platform. It's one of the big devices that's most routinely purchased. And it lets you power a few lights and charge a cell phone. And that is probably the only access to energy that an individual who's purchasing this device has access to. So what is Ngaza? Like I said, we enable sales of life-changing products. And the name itself is Swahili for enlighten. It's because we're trying to provide energy access. And initially, the company was founded as a company that would build these devices, that would build solar-powered lights that could be sold in these markets. But very quickly on, as the company's early days were developing, what we realized was that the biggest challenge wasn't the existence of devices. There were already a number of companies building the lights, but their affordability. And that the biggest barrier to entry for an individual to purchase one of these devices was that even if the cost was, by our standards, relatively cheap, let's say $20 for a light or a couple $100 US for one of these larger systems, that was functionally unaffordable for most people. They didn't have the cash to make a purchase up front, and so they couldn't access a fundamental right like energy. So we pivoted into a software company that enables these devices to be sold on more affordable financial models, like pay-as-you-go basis. So you put down a down payment and gradually pay off the cost of the device. And field agents who go into these communities will use the activator that's pictured up there to collect information about prospective clients, evaluate their creditworthiness, and then actually make a sale. At this point, the company is about 50 people. When I joined, there were 35 of us in January, so it's been growing pretty rapidly during this period, and about half the team is engineering. And that's split between the two offices we have, one in San Francisco, the one that I work for, and one in Nairobi in Kenya, which is a little bit closer to where many of our users live. One thing that makes me an interesting attendee, let alone speaker at this conference, is that as of the start of this quarter, we don't have an ops team. We don't have a DevOps team. We don't have an SRE. And through the entire company's growth, we've actually never hired anyone with that title. We play those parts and we fill those roles, but we don't officially do any of those jobs explicitly. I also want to lay out our company values because I think they provide really important context to the way that we think about developing software, as well as the way that we operate on a daily basis and think about evolving the company's structure. So we have 5 core values that we've focused on as we've grown. These are, first, trying to maximize impact. So every decision we make should have the greatest impact on the greatest number of people. Try and offer the most people access to a life-changing service, like a source of cleaner energy, or a device that can help, like a water pump that might enable them to run their business more effectively. We strive to innovate with empathy. So we understand that we do not come from backgrounds like those of our end users. Many of us are based in San Francisco. We've always been able to take for granted that if we flip a switch, we'll probably have energy. And if it goes out, that's maybe one day out of a year. It's very infrequent. We know that if we turn a tap, we'll have access to water. And so we know that we need to ask questions, we need to understand what our customers care about. And this applies also for the Nairobi office, because we're working in areas that aren't major cities, generally speaking. So even coming from Nairobi, which is geographically closer to most of the users, is still a very different context. So we know that we need to ask questions and be curious and iterate constantly. We also know we need to be courageous. So we need to make bold choices if we want to have a big impact. We can't just rely on traditional standards for software development practices or design practices, because the markets we're working in haven't been traditionally served by technology, so there aren't established best practices. And we know that customers rely on us, both the distributors who sell devices on our platform and those who are using the devices. So we need to make sure that we're deserving their trust. We need to make decisions that offer secure, reliable software in order to serve these companies or these clients best. And lastly, Swahili kind of pervades a little bit of the company culture. We embrace our inner tembo, and the tembo is Swahili for elephant, so it's about supporting the herd, about being kind and supportive and curious at all times. One thing I want to call out is that the photos that I'm using throughout were taken in the field by a really talented developer and photographer I work with. Erin is incredibly talented and deserves credit for all of the great images that are through this presentation. I want to dig a little bit more into our business model also, because I think it explains where technology fits into this. Traditionally, when I give the first explanation of what Ngaza is, people don't necessarily immediately understand where software sits, and I think it's important to understand where software plays a part, because it explains why providing reliable service is so critically important to what we do. So we partner with a number of key groups that are outlined here. The first of these is manufacturers who create devices like water pumps, cook stoves, and solar lights. And we embed metering and monitoring software into those devices so that they can be technically enforced, meaning that if a device is sold and the customer isn't paying off the terms of their loan, we'll temporarily lock the device in order to add some collateral in a market that doesn't otherwise necessarily have a formal credit system or some other way of understanding whether someone is worthy of getting a loan from a financial perspective. And so by adding a little bit of technical enforcement, we can then sell these devices or enable these devices to be sold in markets that don't have access to traditional credit scores. We also work with distributors, which are the companies that sell these devices on a pay-as-you-go basis and offer them a couple software tools. The first of which is the Hub, the core platform that I worked on before, which lets them do things like manage their user base, understand their loan portfolio, and manage basic call center tasks, all from a website that they can use. We also have the Activator, the mobile app that I showed pictures of before, which field agents take into these off-grid regions, potentially operating entirely offline in cases where there's not any data available, to evaluate creditworthiness of individuals and make sales and collect payments to clients who live in these off-grid communities. The last software integration that is core to what we do is integrations with mobile network operators or telecoms in the regions that we work with. So this allows us to collect mobile money. That's one of the common forms of payment. You see cash and you see mobile money, but you don't usually see credit cards, something that we kind of take for granted here. And so we'll accept payments in that form and then send key codes back to the clients so that they can understand how to unlock their device, and they type in a code that provides them with the amount of energy that they've paid for. So you can see up here, software is really at the core of what we do, and providing reliable software is really critical to our operations. And that's why we think reliability matters. We're concerned with two forms of reliability chiefly. One, we know that our platform is business critical, that there are entire companies whose operations are based on the back of the software that we built, and if our software goes down, their alternative is frequently not some other tool that they can turn to, but old school pen and paper, which is not particularly scalable and does not offer for great coordination in pretty far-flung regions. So reliability matters because businesses are built on us. Even more importantly to us, outages disrupt real people. So when we talk about reliability, we're not concerned about how many nines we have just because it's a nice metric to be able to share and a little bit of a bragging right, but we're concerned about the human impact. We care about reliability because people really matter to us, and because an outage has a real impact on the sorts of things that we take for granted every day back in the States, in Nairobi, in New Zealand. Things like being able to turn on a light and use that at night to study, to run your business, kind of anything you want to do with electricity. And it also means that farmers who rely on us for having access to a water pump maybe can't irrigate their farms as efficiently, and their livelihood is disrupted if we fail to send them a key code in a timely fashion. So reliability means a couple very human things to us. It means whether distributors can download and access the platform reports that they rely on to evaluate their loan portfolio. It means whether we're activating a client's lights or their water pump in a timely fashion upon payment. And it means whether agents are able to make a sale, because if an agent can't make a sale, like if there's a bug in the activator, they might have to head back to their home office, which could be several hours away, in order to download an app update, because they don't have a reliable network in the area they're working in. So reliability is really, really critical, and when we talk about it, we care about it in these particular forms, because this is what matters to our users. We use a couple tools to measure reliability. These are only some of them. There's many more that I'm happy to talk to you about later. The first of these is BuildKite, which is a CI/CD tool that we've used to run routine health checks. Every 10 minutes, we check major workflows that we know our partners rely on, and we'll page an engineer if something's gone wrong, because it means that a business has been disrupted. And also, our hours in which we're usually asleep and away from the computer are core business hours for Nairobi, so it's important for many of our markets. So it's really important that they can access the tools that we're developing. We use Grafana, which is a charting tool, in order to have each team sit next to a dashboard that displays relevant metrics. Things like if you're on the mobile network team or the network partnerships team, it's what is the endpoint performance for the endpoint that lets you collect payments. So are we sending those key codes in a timely fashion? Are we processing payments reliably? And lastly, we do routine reviews of all of our Zendesk tickets to understand whether the support team has the tools they need to address questions, whether partners have to ask us questions at all. Ideally, they can self-serve everything they need. And we do these analyses to understand if we're truly providing reliable service. We do them routinely and review them as a full company. So all that explains why reliability is super important to us. This talks a little bit more about why it's so hard to achieve. So we're operating chiefly in South America, Africa, and Asia. We're working in over 30 countries in these regions, and each of the countries we work in is traditionally categorized as an emerging market. So we're talking about, within these countries, rural and peri-urban, so bordering on urban areas. They probably don't have reliable access to grid electricity, otherwise they wouldn't be purchasing these devices. So they either have no access whatsoever, or a really flaky grid that they can't rely on for consistent service. In terms of access to cell phone service, it's frequently either non-existent or very spotty. Walking around Wellington, you get 4G service. In many of the markets we work in, the best case is 2G. And we have a 2G network in our office that we use to simulate things for testing, and I can promise you, you never want to accidentally connect to it. You will probably tear your hair out before the first page loads. So this is a pretty constrained environment we're operating in, and a traditionally underserved one. So Amazon is looking at launching their first hosting zone on the African continent now. It's a market that hasn't been served by technology and where it's really hard to provide reliability. Also, during this period, and this is a great thing, but also a challenging thing, our team's really been growing. The business has gotten a lot of traction, and in the last year, we've grown the team by about 50%. So we added 2 engineering teams in Kenya, as well as a Kenyan QA in the last 9 months. So this is a period of high growth in which we've already covered reliability is highly important to the customers we're serving. Reliability is difficult to achieve by the constraints of the domain, and things are constantly changing. We're hiring a lot of new people. So that requires a lot of innovation in order to continue providing reliable service. So we've gone through a number of eras of evolution during the company's history from 2012 to the present day. I've used mostly the terms that we use to refer to the eras, except in the case of the first one, ad hoc, which was basically a little bit of chaos. It was the start of the company, the first 1 through 4 engineers, and there wasn't really any formal term for what was happening. It was just kind of do what needs to get done. After that, we moved to a tribute model. If any of you are familiar with Hunger Games, that was where this term came from. It was volunteering as tribute to sacrifice yourself for the sake of the team. Not necessarily the ideal model, but honestly how the team talked about it at the time. We next moved on to collectives, which was another way of saying we finally had enough people to have multiple teams. And we made up a new term for it because why just say multiple teams? And then next, and this is the current phase we're in, we developed a series of product teams, taking a lesson from the industry-wide best practices. So to start, our first step in our evolution and the first 1 through 4 engineers was what I've decided to term an ad hoc structure. So we had a single engineering team, and our ops policy by day was basically, you broke it, you fix it. So if you were responsible for introducing something that either resulted in a customer ticket or some sort of production incident, you were the one who had to go fix it because you were the one who had the most context. At night, from very early on, we employed a pager duty rotation. Like I said, the core business hours for most of the markets we work in are while the team would be offline or asleep. So it was important for us to be able to have a pager system so we could get alerted when we might not be checking in on the site. And people were paged on every backend exception in order to make sure that we were serving our customers well. The result was that we had to institute a policy where if you got paged 3 times in a single sprint, you got amnesty. That's not a great indicator because it means that we were paging people at least 3 times in a single sprint for someone to be like, this isn't a humane practice. Can we change this? And once you got amnesty, someone else would take over until the next sprint. And the fact that this model worked was really enabled by the small scale of both the code base and the business operations at the time. We weren't dealing with that many transactions. It was maybe a couple hundred a month, and these days we do orders of magnitude more in a single day. So having a small scale, a small code base made things a lot easier. It's not to say it went perfectly, though there were some things that went well. So we had a pretty small but senior team at the time, which meant that they were taking best practices from much larger companies. They were applying kind of JIT or just-in-time maturity practices, developing guardrails for when the company grew around high-risk areas like data migrations or introducing incident reports as a practice from very early on. We actually introduced tooling for remote server management before any engineers had been hired beyond the CTO, which is something that's paid dividends for us in the long run, and is tooling we still use and build on this day. We were co-located at the time, so everyone sat around a table. It was 4 people in one area. It made for really easy communication, where you could just turn to the person next to or across from you and ask them a question. And from the DevOps perspective, there was no dev versus ops at each other's throats because everyone was playing both roles. That said, this was not a perfect structure. And we kept evolving because it wasn't really sustainable long term. And when you're at a startup, sometimes sustainability isn't the thing you're prioritizing. It's just about making it another day. So it was prioritizing explicitly necessity over sustainability. And every incident was highly disruptive because if you have 1 or 2 people out of a 4-person team jumping on a fire that's occurring, half your team is gone. And so your velocity is pretty slowed, which means that we're not providing beneficial new features to customers on a routine basis. So that led us to the volunteer as tribute model, or shorthanded just tribute. That meant that we were still operating in a single engineering team, but this time we had a cyclical tribute position that would rotate every sprint. So every 2 weeks, someone new would be responsible for fighting every fire that occurred and for protecting the team from interruptions. If they had questions, could still tap someone who was sitting next to them, but chiefly their job was to jump in front of anything that was coming at the team and defend the rest of the team so they could keep delivering the roadmap. So they were protecting the team from interruptions. Everyone else was working on the roadmap. We also introduced at about the same time our first support person, which was a decision that kind of had 2 different sorts of impact on the team. On one hand, we were no longer escalating as many tickets directly to engineering because there was someone else who could respond to them. On the other hand, we got really lucky and hired someone else who happened to be a really talented QA as well, and brought to light some issues that might have otherwise been missed, which meant that Tribute had even more issues coming in and more things to address. We also, by nature of having more people, were able to expand our pager duty rotation. What went well during this phase? Well, by having more people on your pager duty rotation, it's a little bit more sustainable. You're not getting paged every 2 weeks, or like for 2 weeks, you're not getting paged 3 times those 2 weeks. Every 4th cycle, you're getting paged a little bit less routinely. As an individual who's not the tribute, you're dealing with fewer interruptions and can get a little bit more focus. And we also, during this period, introduced a little bit more of the just-in-time maturity practices. So we did blue-green deployments for the first time in a proper fashion, and we started clustering our workloads, so handling incoming web traffic on different machines from the long-running jobs like reports, which let us customize the infrastructure a little bit more to the actual needs of the business and the actual needs of those particular tasks. We did learn some things, and one thing that I found interesting is that this proved to be our shortest-lived structure, so it clearly didn't serve us all that well. We learned that headcount is not the same thing as horizontal scaling. It does not provide you with those benefits. When you hire more people and then ask them to do a much harder job, that does not instantly provide you with better reliability. So we had people who were protecting the team, but these people were protecting the team over a much greater surface area. So it wasn't necessarily an issue that they had introduced or worked on, but just something that had happened somewhere in an ever-expanding code base. And that meant that customer service declined, and that we weren't meeting the reliability metric of letting customers actually run their businesses. It was also hard for us to make investments during this period because we were constantly either sprinting on the Tribute side or just trying to deliver core product functionality during this period. And it's also really hard to hire if you're trying to hire someone so that you can onboard them very quickly into worrying about anything that happens anywhere in your operations or anywhere in your user ticket land. So as we kept growing and as we started to hire more junior people, we realized we needed a new model. So we introduced the collectives and finally separated out teams a little bit so people could specialize a bit more. We created dedicated support and operations teams. Both of these were staffed with engineers, but from a DevOps perspective, I think it's interesting that at this stage we still are staffing our ops teams with traditional developers, and we're rotating the whole team on a quarterly basis, pretty much. Occasionally someone would stay on to carry over some context, but anyone on the team was considered to be qualified to handle operations and to learn more about that. The other teams we had at the time handled things like our core product roadmap, delivering functionality, doing mobile money integrations and those sorts of things, as well as incoming partner requests. And like I said, the teams would rotate quarterly. It let us onboard new engineers in kind of a rotational development program style without having the infrastructure to actually run something like that formally. It let people build breadth by spending a little bit more time on a particular team, as well as depth by getting to see a bunch of teams. So what went well during this phase? It did allow for a little bit more focus on priorities. If you were on the ops team for 3 months, you had some chance to develop context into where the hidden traps lay, and then hopefully clean some of those up and build in some more guardrails, while also shielding the rest of the team from incoming issues. It gave people a little bit more time to get depth so they could specialize in a particular area of the business. And as I said, it did meet the goal of cross-training new engineers. And for that, we were willing to accept some compromises on the other side. And this was a conversation we explicitly had. We're doing this structure. We know it has its trade-offs. We need the benefits that it offers. So one big issue is teams were not operating what they built. So the operations team was responsible for being kind of a multi-person tribute, as was the support team, shielding the rest of the teams from incoming issues so that they could keep delivering on the roadmap. On one hand, that's nice because it means that they can stay focused. On the other hand, it's depriving these teams of the really valuable lessons that come with seeing the long-term consequences of the design decisions you make. And that was ultimately, we decided, the wrong decision and led us to our next evolution. Also, if you're on ops or support and you're trying to shield every other team, it makes for a difficult juggling act. So you're trying to balance between fighting fires and delivering on the roadmap, and you're starting to realize where an issue is, and then your quarter passes and you have to hand over all of that context, and that's a really hard thing to transfer. So a quarter, basically what it would look like was you spend a month ramping up, understanding the team you've just joined, a month and a half feeling like I've really hit my stride and I'm now developing things effectively, and then the last 2 weeks looking forward, trying to figure out how you can hand over context. And so that time goes by really quickly and doesn't necessarily let you make as many long-term investments as you'd like. Plus, all the context switching that the structure involved was really costly because you're every 3 months trying to learn new things. So our new structure, now that we've grown a little bit more, takes the traditional model of product teams. So we now have 5 engineering teams, 3 in San Francisco, 2 in Nairobi. The ones in Nairobi are really teams that are best served by being close to the locality of our partners. So things like the telecom integrations, where it's nice to be able to get on the phone or go to a meeting at the office of a partner. Or the team working with agents, where being able to go into the field to actually see how the mobile application is being used is really beneficial to trying to develop better software. Each of these teams is aligned with some core business vertical. It has a KPI, a key indicator that it can measure in order to understand its performance as a team and make sure we're serving the business and our customers. And each of these teams is responsible for the full lifetime of the products it works on. So everything from, for the service of the KPIs you're trying to achieve, what products should we be building? What features should we be adding? All the way through, how do we develop them well? How do we make sure that our designs are extensible? And then ending in continuing to operate them long after they've been released and for the full lifetime of the product. We've reintroduced the tribute model, but this time on a per-team basis instead of trying to cover the whole company. So it's a little bit more manageable. Your surface area is much smaller and more closely limited to things you've actually worked on. And we did away with, largely due to the sizing constraints of the company at this point, our DevOps team. So we have the tributes serving the roles of firefighters and also cross-team coordination. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the intended goals and about our expected challenges. And one thing that I've really appreciated at Ngaza is that we've been having these conversations since long before we actually made the transition about what are the benefits we're trying to achieve, what outcomes do we want to see in the world, how do we provide more reliable service, and then what are the challenges, what are the things we're going to have to counterbalance about the inherent flaws in this design. So our intended goals are to have independent teams that can deliver without relying on each other or being blocked by each other. We want each of these teams to own what it builds, to be able to understand and maintain the services, understand how to deploy them, understand how to operate them, understand where the users are falling into issues and where the traps lie. We want them to be supporting core business KPIs and making sure that they're serving our users. And we want the tribute model to serve as a way of offering cross-team coordination and global cross-team coordination. So we know that in adding 2 engineering teams in Kenya, we're bringing ourselves to this potential challenge, which I talk about up there, of global knowledge sharing. We've always had some sort of operation in Kenya, focused chiefly on sales or partnerships. But this is the first time we're having an engineering team there, and we're really excited about the opportunities it offers, but it also introduces some new challenges. We also know that in having a structure that is product team oriented, there's the possibility for shared services to fall into this area of everyone owns them and no one's responsible for them, which is a common trap. I see a couple people nodding. It's definitely a thing you've experienced before. And that's why we introduced the tributes. It's basically because we're worried about the risks of this, and we want some group that feels like it is explicitly my responsibility to go handle a production incident when it occurs. It is explicitly my responsibility, and this is something we talk about as a full team, as everyone's responsibility, to invest in developer tooling, to make sure that our deployments are running smoothly, and where we see issues, to go and address those with equal importance to the actual product investments. Lastly, we know that in returning to the tribute system, we're again asking people for 2 weeks to step out of the traditional workflow, maybe miss a little bit of what's happening on the product roadmap, and then come back and redevelop that context. But it's a smaller surface area, so we expect it to be a little bit more sustainable. So what's next for us? We're planning on continuing growing the team. One other kind of value that we talk about, or another way we share our values, that I didn't highlight earlier is that we have every member of the engineering team sign on to an engineering constitution. The photos up there are of some of the most recent engineers who joined in Nairobi signing on to this engineering constitution. And while our core values, the 5 values I talked about earlier, kind of speak to what we value at a high level as a business overall, regardless of your role, the engineering constitution lays out in very explicit terms things that we consider really key engineering practices, and it's a living document. It lives on GitHub. Everyone signs it. There's a chance to go through like a PR system to update what we think is valuable based on the lessons that we learn. And these values include things like preferring reliable, clear designs over things that are shiny and new and maybe a little bit more confusing. We want to try and be smart and explicit rather than just clever. We know that the code we develop is going to be used and maintained by people who come from very different backgrounds, from different sorts of software engineering training, from different lifestyles and different localities. And so it's really important that we're designing code that can be understood by someone just when they read it. We also have very explicit PRs when we are trying to do cross-team coordination. It's important to document the ideas that you have so someone who's awake when you're asleep and vice versa can understand the code that you've written. And so part of why we do this and part of why we have new engineers read and sign this constitution is to make sure that it's actually a living document that's being maintained. A couple of the other speakers have talked about how if you're developing tooling that you never actually touch again, you're probably going to turn to it one day and realize it's wildly out of date. But if every time you have a new engineer join, you have them sign on to this value system, it means that it's a living document. As long as you're continuing to hire and you're continuing to grow, you have an explicit opportunity to revisit your values and make sure you're serving them. So beyond continuing to grow our team, we're looking at a few practices that might counterbalance some of the trade-offs of the design we've picked for our organization. So we're looking at introducing working groups as a semi-formal way of coordinating across the ocean. So groups of interest oriented around whether they're short-term things like migrating our front-end code, the last bit of it that's still in Knockout, into React, or a longer-term investment like a team oriented around build pipelines or DevOps best practices. And these communities can act as knowledge-sharing vessels, basically, in order to funnel insights from both sides of the ocean. I also want to be very explicit that we don't think in our San Francisco office, even though there's a lot of tech companies near us, that we have a monopoly on good ideas about technology. Nairobi has a very vibrant tech scene, and so being able to leverage the insights from that and channel those back to San Francisco is at least as important, if not more, than the channeling of insights from San Francisco to Nairobi. Particularly because we're working in markets that haven't been served by technology, a lot of the insights into how you develop offline code well are going to be coming back from Nairobi, not sent over. We'll also probably add things like SRE as we continue to grow. This team won't be responsible for shielding other teams from production, but instead enabling them to deliver more effectively. And lastly, we're looking at ways that we can turn that challenge of having teams in two very different localities and time zones into an opportunity to be able to offer 24-hour global coverage without having to ever wake someone up in the middle of the night. So how do we turn what could be a challenge into an opportunity for us? So I wanted to highlight some key takeaways, some lessons that I learned in reflecting on our growth that I think apply whether you're working on trying to provide access to power to off-grid communities or offering small business loans or access to the news to a community in New Zealand. First of these is maximize impact. So like I said, what you should be focusing on is how do you have the greatest impact on all of your users. Prefer dependable tools over fashionable ones. Don't worry about what's shiny and new. Worry about what works for you. Prefer industry standard technology and get creative when it's necessary. So for us, that means that a lot of our deployment tooling, we're using AWS, we're using traditional services on that end, but certain areas like integrating with a solar powered system in order to provide a pay-as-you-go model is pretty much uncharted territory. There are a couple companies that are doing similar things, but they've all cropped up at about the same time we have, so there's no way of adopting a best practice. You have to get creative. Next, deserve their trust. So like I said, reliability matters because people do, because people depend on your system. So define what reliability means to your users and to your domain. Measure that and pursue it relentlessly. This should be your core value. Are you serving the workflows that your customers actually care about? Are you enabling them to achieve whatever they might be trying to achieve? And lastly, evolve and do so with empathy. Like I said, this is key for when you're designing software, kind of for any market. It's a lesson that's come up already several times during the course of yesterday's talks. And this means don't be dogmatic about structure. Get creative. Think about how you can adapt constantly and do it differently. And be innovative with this so that you can always be serving your customers best. One thing I want to emphasize here is the last part of that. You also should be empathetic to your team. Because each reorg, for anyone who's been a part of one, you know that it can be a highly disruptive process. I don't think I need to tell anyone that. So evolving with empathy, understanding that your users, when you do organizational design, are not just your customers, but also the people on your team, is really critical. You need to talk to people, make sure you understand their concerns, make sure they feel engaged, and sometimes be explicit about the trade-offs you're making. So yes, we know we're asking you to wake up in the middle of the night, but we're doing it because we're providing this service that people depend on. Those sorts of compromises can lead people who would otherwise be your biggest critics to become your biggest advocates. So those are the lessons that I've learned in working at Ngaza. If you're interested in talking more about designing software for traditionally underserved markets, what it looks like to do reliable software at a startup and kind of which investments to make when, or really anything else that I've talked about, you can find me, like I said, now on Twitter. You can find us at Ngaza Design, or I will be here through the rest of the conference, and I am more than happy to talk about any of these topics. I've found it an incredibly interesting domain, and I would love to learn any lessons you've had in the companies you worked with that we could possibly take in and incorporate into the way that we operate. So thank you all for your time, and thank you for hosting me here again.